Today we're going to be talking about the grisly death, which was apparently witnessed by quite a few people and well recorded, and the spectacular rise and eminent life of one Thomas Becket. This will help ease us back into the conclusion of the Richard the Lionheart series for the upcoming next two episodes to finish out that 6-part series. But today we are joined by Dr. Paul Webster, who actually appeared on the podcast in the 4th episode, where he and I spoke about King John, whether he was bad or unlucky. Before we jump in, if you would like to read more creative takes on medieval history, please see the link for Feigned Flight magazine below. That's a magazine of which I am the creative director, and our goal is to bring you lots of creative, interesting, conceptual takes on medieval history. You could subscribe for free to get an email with an essay each week in your inbox, and pretty soon we will be opening it up for paid supporters to support our work, and paid supporters will be getting 2 essays a week in their inbox. And we have a team of 3 editors that are curating these essays, that are working with writers. So it's not just stuff that we are coming up with on the fly, anything that's low quality. We're working with authors. We have a team of editors, and we're making sure that you get the absolute best of modern creative writing on medieval history. And I don't want to interrupt the episode with any other bits of housekeeping. So if you would like to give a gift to the history lover in your life, check out Cards of History. The link in the description will give you 10% off on your purchase. It's the only place on the internet that you can get 10% off on Cards of History, and it's a wonderful gift for the person in your life who loves history. Today we're talking with Dr. Paul Webster. He's a senior lecturer in medieval history at Cardiff University in the School of History, Archaeology, and Religion, where he coordinates the Exploring the Past pathway to degrees in history, archaeology, and religion, a partnership with the university's Division of Lifelong Learning, providing opportunities to progress to degrees for mature students returning to study. His teaching and research in medieval history focus on kingship, religion, and the relationship between monarchy and the cult of the saints. He has focused in particular on King John, which was the previous episode that he was on, and the life and legacy of Saint Thomas Becket. So without further ado, Thomas Becket is, it seems to me, one of the most influential non-nobles, perhaps, of certainly in his period, of the medieval period, and maybe certainly one of the top ones across time. He seems to have a rather extraordinary rise to his power. It seems like being the son of a lower nobility, maybe even like a poor knight, or
the son of a London merchant. Yeah.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about his sort of upbringing, and maybe set the table for sort of how he came into prominence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the part of his life where least is known about it, but he's the son of a London merchant, a man called Gilbert Becket. He's born somewhere around 1120, possibly give or take a couple of years. And he, I mean, I think we could think about Gilbert as someone who, yes, he's not as high in status as others in society, but he's still making a decent income as a merchant in London. And potentially there are family connections in Normandy and that sort of thing. So Becket, through that household, that clearly his family are keen to educate him. And there is a sense that he was educated, maybe spent time at the universities in Paris and Bologna. So the leading centers for theology and for law of the day. Whether he was a good student is something that is distinctly up for grabs, I think. But he made contacts there, if nothing else, even if he didn't get a reputation for studiousness. And then he returns and he finds service in the household of a knight, whose name I think is Gilbert de L'Aigle. And he's involved in that household. He's going hunting with the knight. He's doing those sorts of things. And I think he then ends up back in London, but then in the household of Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. And it's from there that he rises to greater prominence. Firstly, as someone who gets fairly close to the inner circle with Theobald, and then through Theobald being elevated in the sort of general direction of serving the crown.
Theobald is the one who recommends him for the position of chancellor to Henry II. Is that right?
Absolutely that, yep. So Theobald has a household of a number of people who rise up and become prominent later on, and not least through Theobald's influence. One of them is Becket. One of them is a man called Roger of Pont l'Evêque, who goes on to become Archbishop of York. And Becket has been with Theobald to things like papal councils, particularly one during Stephen's reign, where there is some controversy about whether the king really wanted the archbishop to go. But the archbishop goes anyway, and he takes Becket with him. And yeah, when Stephen's reign comes to an end and Henry II comes to the throne, it seems to be Theobald who puts Becket forward as the man who could be the royal chancellor, be the king's right-hand man, in a number of ways, and possibly with a view that would help to smooth relations between the crown and the church in the person of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
So I have a couple questions here. It seems like this time period that Thomas Becket is sort of rising in prominence is roughly around the time of the Second Crusade, but that doesn't really have much of an impact on Angevin Empire, on England, or anything like that, right?
No, it doesn't. It has impact on the Kingdom of France, because Louis VII, and indeed his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, participate in the Second Crusade. It has impact in Germany because the Emperor Conrad III and the future Emperor Frederick Barbarossa take part. But within England, there is perhaps some interest, but it's not at the same level as it is in France and Germany.
This is going to come into, I'm sure, as we sort of talk about Thomas Becket's life going on here. I'm just trying to get a sense of maybe his earlier theological development, I guess, because that's going to come into play, I guess, later when he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. What would you say are some of the, I guess, the Archbishop of Canterbury, obviously, but what were maybe some of the big influences on him in this earlier period, maybe other than that?
Well, it's an interesting question as to whether there are particularly theological influences on him at this period. He's had enough training that he can write, so he can be a clerk and he can work in people's households. And there are routes you can go down from there, which might involve becoming a priest, might involve, if I'm in with the royal service, might then involve rising up the ecclesiastical hierarchy with a bit of assistance from the king. His theological awakening, if you like, doesn't really come until he's archbishop, and arguably it doesn't then come until he's in exile and actually has time to sit down with some of his then entourage and learn some of the finer points. Equally, though, he has been in Paris, so he has been at the leading school of the day, and in the circles of some of the leading theologians. So some of that should have been there if he was attending his lectures and paying attention. And the question there is, how much was early Becket actually a bit of a party goer? And how much did that spill over? He goes into Gilbert de Laigle's service as a clerk, and he's going hunting with Gilbert, so he clearly is enjoying some of the good times there. But in Theobald's household, he's also, he becomes Archdeacon of Canterbury, so some of that legal training is coming in there, because that role would have him working in the church courts. So there's throughout Becket's life, there's an interesting mix and an interesting question of what is the balance there. And our picture of it is, to some extent, skewed by writers who knew what happened, and who are seeking to set him up as someone who they can later be credibly portrayed as a saint. So I would say that the influences are perhaps less theological, though he must have been exposed to some of those things, and he must have been, a number of the people he probably studied alongside very definitely were. and they would also be then legal, because that would be the sorts of things that would explain why he came to Theobald's attention, why he became archdeacon, and why he was then an appropriate person to say, actually, this guy is quite good at this. So why not make him royal chancellor and have him kind of guiding the king's hand in the secular world?
So maybe you could tell us a little bit, especially for me, the uneducated, what exactly is sort of the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then I guess his role as Archdeacon? What are they doing?
Well, I mean, there's several. I mean, maybe we should throw in the role of royal chancellor there as well.
That was going to be
So
my
the
follow up.
right, okay, fair enough. So the Archdeacon of Canterbury is essentially the person who runs the ecclesiastical courts within the province of Canterbury. And I wouldn't claim a huge amount of expertise on what an archdeacon does, but if the church is running essentially an independent set of courts in which people who can claim to be churchmen are being tried. And these are separate from the secular courts run under secular law, which invariably are operating a harsher system of punishment. And this will come to be a live part of the debate between Henry II and Becket later on, because this is something that Henry wants to bring under his own control. It's also something where the post holder has a certain amount of opportunity to enrich themselves through the profits of justice, essentially. But they're not sentencing people to the more severe, life-threatening, limb-threatening sentences that the secular courts are. The Archbishop is the head of the province, the ecclesiastical province of Canterbury. So he is the chief among the bishops of that area. For England, there are two provinces, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. York is a smaller archbishopric, but the idea is that then the bishops of the different areas, different episcopal sees, are answerable then to one of those two archbishops, and in England most of them are answerable to Canterbury. So he is, if you like, the senior churchman. He's quite often, though this doesn't have to be the case, also the Pope's man on the ground, and the Pope will often grant a papal legateship to essentially exercise authority on behalf of the Pope within that ecclesiastical province. This is a role that Becket will go on to secure as Archbishop. It's one that Theobald didn't have, or didn't always have, because of the presence of a highly influential Bishop of Winchester, Henry of Blois, who was related to King Stephen. Royal Chancellor then is really on the other side of the coin, because that's the king's right-hand man in secular matters. The Chancellor is in charge in particular of the King's Writing Office. So all the documents that are going out from the Crown are being done through the Chancellor as perhaps, as definitely the person who is holding the royal seal, and therefore has the ultimate authority for the letters that are sent out in the King's name. So he has a really important role in the oversight of any sort of government business being done in the King's name. And a king and a chancellor who are working in lockstep can be a very powerful combination. And the rewards of that can be that person who is chancellor either goes on to or simultaneously holds a bishopric. It's not always the case, but it's sometimes the case, and this will become relevant when Henry tries to make Becket Archbishop of Canterbury.
So his move then from archdeacon to chancellor is in a way kind of a lateral move per se. It's almost like COO in one aspect to COO in the other, although it's for you're in the religious area in one and then the secular area in the other. Is that kind of a fair estimation?
That's a nice way of thinking about it. Yeah, and quite possible to hold those roles simultaneously as well.
Okay, so he gets elected to, or gets appointed, I suppose, to chancellor, and
Yep.
things are, as I understand, their relationship when he's chancellor is pretty good, right? Things are
They are
going reasonably
absolutely in
well.
lockstep. Yep, one of the chroniclers, William Fitzstephen, says that never in Christian times have there been two greater friends, more of one mind. Henry is sending Becket on diplomatic expeditions. There's one where he goes to Paris for the initial negotiations that lead to the marriage of Henry's son to the French king's daughter. And Becket takes such a big entourage that the chroniclers say that what do they say? They say that the French people looking on at this said, "Wow, if this is the way that the king's chancellor travels, how great must the king be?" Now, of course, it's a deliberate show, but it's a nice image. So they are definitely working very close together, and seem to be. There's a hint of a falling out when Becket and Henry are both at the siege of Toulouse, and there's a question of whether or not Henry should attack the French king in the city of Toulouse or not. They seem to get through that, and yes, on he goes, and he is Henry's candidate for Canterbury. And you used both the words elected and appointed there, and that's actually a very good way of thinking about it, because the way of doing this is that when Theobald dies, there should be an election. Indeed, there is an election. But this is a point where the crown is very much trying to exercise its sway over the election of people to bishoprics and archbishoprics. There's a letter which may be apocryphal, may not be, but it's quoted in the sources for a different bishopric, where Henry II is said to have written to the people doing the election and said, "We order you to hold an election." Sounds fine, but nonetheless, we order you to elect such and such a person. And I think they maybe don't always do it that blatantly, but certainly, the crown sometimes tries to hold these things at the royal court, and sometimes it sends royal agents to that election with a very clear sense of who the king wants to be elected at the end of the day.
And it seems like various kings have gone through periods of trying to control religious affairs, let's say. And I think, conversely, there's been popes that have gone to quite lengths. I think Innocent III is one to try to control secular affairs. And it seems like Henry II was definitely one of the foremost, at least in my mind. You can obviously maybe elaborate on this a little bit, but he seems kind of on the foremost of one of those kings that really tried to control religious affairs. Is that kind of a fair estimation?
Yeah, I think so. Henry is into control. He's come to the throne after the turmoil of the disputed reign of King Stephen, and he comes to the throne at a period when royal power is diminished. I think it's fair to say. And actually, one of the things that he does with Becket as Chancellor is the whole process of consolidating and bringing back the power of the crown in the name of the king. So they are making sure that that royal licenses to build castles are issued, and castles that have been built without them are demolished. They're stamping their authority over leading noblemen. They're doing all sorts of things in the secular sphere. And I think the general thought is that Henry's hope in orchestrating Becket's election as archbishop is that he can extend that reach. And Becket can be both chancellor and archbishop, and therefore the king's person, extending the royal reach both in the secular sphere and over the church.
Yeah, and we'll get to that pretty shortly here. I do want to kind of just talk a little bit about his chancellorship a little bit more, because I think this is like an area that I think is much less talked about, certainly much less known. What other kind of effects or influences did he have as far as exercising Henry's power?
Well, I think we can sort of think about him as very much the king's man and acting in place of the king. And to the point that Henry is thinking of very influential roles for Becket, not only in relation to the reign itself, but in relation to the succession. One of the things that is brewing around the time of his election to archbishop is the idea, sort of an idea of Becket as a protector and guide for Henry's son, the younger Henry. And one of the things that runs through from just before the period of Becket's election as Archbishop, right the way through to the end of the dispute, is the question of the younger Henry's coronation as heir apparent, and that's a sort of sense of Henry saying, "Well, I want to be like the French kings, who crown the heir within the ruler's lifetime." Doesn't work out like that, but it's one example of it. What else can we say? I mean, we can certainly sort of highlight the number of letters and things like that we know Becket is involved with in the course of the reign, that show that he really is fulfilling this role as Chancellor, of acting for and almost as the king, without it ever being anything other than in Henry II's name. We know that he's at the siege of Toulouse with Henry in 1159, and he's there with troops. So there's a military aspect to it. And I mean, I guess all the work that Henry is doing to restore royal authority and to get the royal courts running again and moving towards some of the legal reforms or legal innovations he'll attempt later on are built on the platform of what he does with Becket in the 1150s and the very early 1160s.
And I would like to talk about this incident of the siege of Toulouse a little bit, because I'm familiar with the beginning of it, not so familiar with, I guess, the reconciliation afterwards. And it's a very interesting situation because I'll let you, I suppose, fill in the gaps here. I guess Toulouse is sort of disputed between the King of France and Henry. And so Henry's going to go, he raises a big army to go assert essentially his authority. And the King of France, in a very weakened state, he doesn't have nearly as much land, power, troops as Henry does. But he basically decides that he's going to go run into the castle before Henry can get there. So that way, when Henry arrives, he's sort of in this predicament as to whether attack the castle of his sworn sovereign who's in the castle or not. And so this is kind of a predicament for Henry. And Becket advises him that he should just go ahead and attack the castle, take the king prisoner, do whatever you got to do. Henry ultimately decides not to, which in my estimation, I feel like that sort of shows generally the, despite their conflicts, the Plantagenet attempt to be good vassals. I think in my view, I mean, you can obviously expand on this if you'd like. In my view, the Plantagenets are attempting for the most part to essentially just assert their normal rights. They're not being aggressive on the King of France, whereas the kings of France strike me as rather insecure and trying to undermine the plan, like sort of offensively attempting to undermine the Plantagenets. That's my view anyway. But I think, and anyway, this incident, Henry, he decides not to. I guess he withdraws his army, and but that obviously creates this, I guess, a little bit of a rift between him and Becket. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that maybe gets repaired.
I guess it's just that things go back to normal. But you're right, there is something there about, and it will be brought up later on, that Henry will raise this bad counsel, and he will raise various things that he's seen Becket doing that weren't a problem when relations were smooth, but then can be made a problem when you're looking to, I suppose, make an example of someone. I think that does say, as that incident also tells us something about the way in which the Plantagenets see the different strands of their authority. So that, in England, Henry is King of England, but actually, in Normandy, he's Duke of Normandy. In Anjou, he's Count of Anjou. He's Duke of Aquitaine by right of marriage, but actually the power for Aquitaine is Eleanor, Louis's former queen, and then Henry's. And, the intervention in Toulouse, Henry is acting by right of his wife. But ultimately, both he and Eleanor are vassals of the French king, and it's that interesting playoff between the sort of nominal authority of the King of France and his ability to actually exercise or wield the clout of that authority. And he's to some extent relying on the aura for protection. Equally, I think there's a question there about, what is pragmatic in this situation. And I think it's probably fair to say that Becket in later years will show the same sort of urge to do something decisive, and where others would argue caution. You can certainly sometimes see his advisors trying to pull him back later on. For Henry, I guess it's, well, if he attacks Louis outside Toulouse, what does he potentially unleash?
Well, I think, it would have been essentially a civil war at that point, right? Or, he would have, I think effectively you have to say that you have to take over the crown. You have to say you're the king. You have to usurp the throne. I mean, you kind of have to do that if you're going to take the king prisoner, right? But the difficult part of something like that, I think, is that it's sort of, and I forget who I was speaking with that said something along these lines. The difficulty for Henry, and I think this is sort of, in a way, maybe sort of one of the, I suppose, good things about the feudal system of these oaths is that if Henry is seen undermining his own oath, what does that say to those who have sworn oaths to him? So he's kind of in that predicament of taking a short-term advantage in that way sort of creates potential very disastrous longer-term consequences for him.
No, indeed, particularly if actually you've just spent several years trying to firm up the security of the sorts of oaths that are being sworn to you after a period of civil war in the Kingdom of England. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so then Thomas Becket is appointed. He goes from being chancellor and being the king's man, being very reliable, being all over the place with troops and writing letters and essentially doing whatever Henry wants. And they're fast friends and a great pair. Then he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. What happens to him?
Well, the thought is that it's relatively it's a smooth relationship early on, but it quite quickly deteriorates, and it deteriorates because Becket is not prepared to do the sorts of things he was doing as Chancellor. And really, within a matter of months, he's resigned as Chancellor, which is, for me, I feel that's a big flag of things to come, because it seems like that Henry has had this vision that he could have Becket in the two roles of Chancellor and Archbishop, and as the sort of mentor for the younger Henry. And that would sort of, in some ways, allow Henry to be a bit more wide-ranging, maybe to spend more time in France, and for the younger Henry to be brought up to kingship through it. And he's certainly seeing a role for Becket that's very not dissimilar to the way that the German emperors are working at that point. And of course, by stepping back from the chancellorship, Becket is destroying that. It can't work. There's also then various things that become flashpoints, because Henry is thinking, can I extend my reach into the church and into the church courts? And what he seems to be expecting is Becket to do all the things that he's done as Chancellor and to be essentially working in lockstep. And Becket is suddenly pressing back and saying, no, I'm the church's person now. And you need to not interfere in the church courts, and you need to not impose reforms. And this gradually becomes a bigger argument, and Henry becomes more pressing and is sort of suddenly starts bringing up all the things that Becket has done in the past that could be held against him.
Is the theory for this that Becket is the top man in his environment, so to speak, that, whatever his environment is, he's going to essentially be loyal to that. So as he's the chancellor, he's going to be, the top king's man. He's going to be the king's man. Yeah. He's going to do whatever he says. And then he goes in to be the archbishop. And now I'm the church's man. I'm going to do whatever. Or is the theory more that he has sort of more religious conviction, some sort of, you know, a religious experience, some sort of what's sort of the theory with the change
I
of
mean,
this
some
behavior?
of the writers about him would try and have you believe that he had this sort of Damascene conversion upon becoming archbishop. I wonder if we can actually look at this slightly differently, though, because he's been the person who's answerable to the king and who has been seen to be doing the king's will. That actually creates a whole load of problems for the people that you're then being asked to kind of lead if you're dropped into the role of archbishop. So think about him, as it were, on his first day at Canterbury, or maybe the first time that he's got like all the bishops in the room, or the monastic community in Canterbury in the room, or whatever. They are looking at him going with some suspicion, going, he has been the king's man. How can he lead either the bench of bishops, the Canterbury province? How can he be the representative of the monks of Canterbury Cathedral? Because Canterbury is a monastic cathedral, he's essentially the titular head of that. How, if he is going to be effective in actually exercising the role of archbishop, he needs to show some leadership for those groups. He cannot be simply the king's man. So he, in a way, he's stuck between God and king here. This is before we think about the Pope as somebody else to whom he's now answerable, and who is perhaps expecting him to work in particular ways. So I think he has this impossible balancing act, where almost whichever way he chooses to take it, he's going to offend somebody. And ultimately, he opts for attempting to defend the various church interests. Though then falling victim to the fact that, particularly with the bishops, you're actually looking at a load of people who are also king's men, who don't seem to have quite the same trouble with squaring the circle that Becket turns out to have.
So then would you say the theory, I guess, so to speak, is maybe that he's just, he's just sort of put in this impossible situation and he has to effectively pick sides. And this comes as, I think it's fair to say, a relative shock to Henry, who I think it's also probably fair to say takes this pretty poorly.
Yes. And I mean, the historian Anne Duggan once put this, I think, in answer to a conference paper or something like that, very nicely. She said, Henry is a man who you don't cross and who doesn't forgive. And once you have done those things, if there's a way back at all, it's an exceedingly long one. But probably there isn't. And that means that Henry very quickly starts trying to corner Becket. And he does so by thinking about the things that he thinks about in, say, the Constitutions of Clarendon, where he's ostensibly trying to establish what the customs of his ancestors were, or this is what he says he's doing. But in also setting those down in writing, he's trying to set down what he sees the limits of church power should be. And we could think, if you want, about some of the various sort of points that centers on.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Constitution of Clarendon, or I forget exactly what. Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that and what's in there and what exactly he's trying to do?
Yeah, so what he's trying to do is he's trying to get Becket and the bishops to agree to abide by the customs of Henry's ancestors. And a lot of what Henry has done in his legal activity and his re-establishment of royal power up to that point is, in a sense, to try and pretend that Stephen's reign didn't exist. And to say that they are going back to the time of Henry I, and that's being sort of set up, whether they're actually doing it or not, but it's being set up as a sort of gold standard of what they're saying they want, where they're saying they want to be. So in bringing together the constitutions, what Henry is trying to do, and there is a council at Clarendon, which is a royal residence just outside Salisbury, which Henry spends a lot of time at and actually spends a fair amount of time redeveloping. He gathers people together. He gets Becket and the bishops to agree to this idea that they will abide by the customs. And then he says, right, we're going to send a group of the older and more experienced laymen out of the room to draw up a list of what those customs were, and then you can agree to them in writing. And that's where that becomes a flashpoint. But then what it's about things like, well, can churchmen be tried for the most serious crimes only in the church courts? One of the things that Henry is trying to do is to say, well, they could be tried in the church courts, but then they should be handed over to the secular courts for punishment. And that, of course, then removes the loophole of people getting more lenient penalties for the more serious crimes, and means that the full weight of royal justice can actually be brought against them. What else is he trying to do? He's trying to make sure that people who have, churchmen in particular, who are involved in legal proceedings with the crown can't appeal to the Pope as a higher authority. So he's trying to say things like, if you're going to leave the kingdom, you need the royal permission before you do so. So that if anyone's in this sort of dispute, he can kind of say, nope, you're not going to Rome, you're not going to appeal to the Pope, we'll stick here and sort it all out. There are various other things around the sorts of sanctions churchmen can impose on laymen, the sorts of things that royal officials are being hit with if they're overstepping what church sees as the bounds. Those are probably the main sort of things that are within it. But you can see, in a way, that ties in with the extension of royal authority that he's been doing before, but it takes it firmly into the ballpark of the church.
So it sounds like this Constitution of Clarendon is sort of, since Thomas Becket is kind of like not working out, so to speak, it's sort of his roundabout way of trying to do these things without him, or sort of pressure him into sort of getting some of these things done.
Pressure him into doing some of those things, because initially what happens is that Becket and the bishops, they hum and haver and then they agree to it. And I think Becket almost immediately regrets doing that, but he's done it now. So it's, in theory, this is going ahead. And Henry then starts pressing further at what he can do to bring his archbishop down. And so he brings up charges of embezzlement. When Becket was chancellor, he finds reasons to attempt to, there's a further council fairly soon afterwards at Northampton, where the thought is that Henry is attempting to put Becket on trial.
And is this what prompts Becket to flee to France?
This is when Becket, he sticks it out for a few days and then he runs away. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's you brought up earlier Henry being somebody who doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. I forget exactly how you phrased it, but I think his inflexibility is sort of notoriously seen later in his life with his own children. And so if he's sort of that inflexible with his own children, you can sort of only imagine if you're, I don't know, some random guy.
Yeah.
All right. So Becket flees to France. What happens next for him?
So he goes into exile in France, and a number of his followers go with him. The people who've been in his household have been advising him. There are two places where he ends up living in his exile. One is the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, which is in sort of central France, vaguely near the city of Auxerre. And it's one of the earlier Cistercian religious houses, and so it's following the Cistercian rule, and so it's a fairly austere lifestyle that he's living there. Some of his followers go with him. So a man called Herbert of Bosham, who's very close to Becket throughout this period, go with him, and possibly what people like Herbert are doing while Becket is at Pontigny is kind of working up Becket's what we might call Becket's religious education. So bringing some of that theology to bear, and kind of, it's, in a way, he has some study time, even though he's clearly firing off letters right, left, and centre and getting the Pope involved and things like that. Later on, he will then also go to the city of Sens, because Henry orchestrates for Becket to be thrown out of Pontigny, I think by saying he'll confiscate all the Cistercian lands in England or something like that. So there are two centres to it. And of course, at Sens, that does actually bring him closer to the papal court, because the papal court is at that time in exile from Rome in the Kingdom of France.
And the Pope, if I recall, doesn't quite fully back up Thomas Becket. Is that right?
No, the Pope at this time is Pope Alexander III. And he's in a difficult position too, because he's in dispute with the Emperor, there is a dispute between papacy and empire over who should be Pope. And the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa is pushing alternative candidates, and to the extent that Alexander III, for a good part of the 1160s, is in exile in the Kingdom of France. And that means that Alexander doesn't have, say, the clout that Innocent III would have later on in John's reign. He's always got to think about the fact that if he pushes too hard on Henry II, Henry II will fall into the imperial camp and back the anti-pope. And Henry knows that too, and is sending envoys to Germany, even if he's not necessarily all that serious about jumping into the camp of the anti-pope. He will give that impression because it's a useful impression to gain some leverage in all this. And of course, the French king too doesn't really want to be surrounded by hostile rulers in league with each other. So Alexander has to tread his way through this. And he shows backing for Becket. For instance, he makes him papal legate to England, but then Becket isn't in England. But he tries to hold, at intervals, he's really clearly to be seen holding Becket back from throwing sanctions at people. And increasingly, that seems to be Becket's inclination. Sometimes he manages to do it, but then those people appeal and Alexander sort of quashes the sanctions, and it starts going round in circles in that sense. But until Alexander is able to get back to Rome, which he does do in the later stages of this period, he doesn't have as much of the clout as he might want to have, and he does have that middle ground to try and pick his way through.
And so then there is a way made essentially for Thomas Becket to return from exile. What happens there?
Yeah, well, there's several attempts at settlement through the later 1160s, particularly sort of 1169, 1170. And they always seem to stick on the oaths that either Becket or Henry II have sworn, or on something that somebody said. So actually, right from sort of time of the Constitutions of Clarendon, Becket has been saying that, or say, well, the church position is that we will agree to this, and we will agree to what the king wants, but we will do so, quote, saving our order. Meaning that we'll agree to it as far as to a certain extent, but where the things the king wants to do infringes upon the rights of the church, that's a no. And of course, that's for Henry, that's a no. You're agreeing to the bits you want to, and you're not actually letting me gain any ground here. So that comes up, and sometimes Becket seems to throw that phrase in at the last minute when everybody thinks it's been resolved. And there's one instance where there's a council with both the kings of England and France, and they're almost there, and then Becket says saving our order, and everybody goes ballistic. And even some of Becket's followers are saying, what? The other thing that happens is that a sticking point becomes whether or not Henry and Becket will exchange the kiss of peace, which would be a symbol of that we're going to let bygones be bygones and everything is fine for everybody now. But Henry has apparently sworn that he will never give Becket the kiss of peace. So at least one settlement falls through because of that. They eventually get to a point, and really the tipping point is that Henry decides that he is just jolly well going to press ahead with the coronation of his son as associate king. And he does this in England with the Archbishop of York and the bishops of Salisbury and London. And that's the point where Alexander weighs in, and sanctions are levelled not against Henry but against others. And Henry decides that actually this might be the point where we should try and broker something. So they agree a settlement in 1170 at a place called Fretaval. And the thing about the kiss of peace is got around by a sort of reconciliation that involves things like the holding of stirrups from the horses and that sort of thing, that show a sort of degree of humility and a degree of recognition of the other. The chroniclers report close conversations between the two men. Henry then says to Becket, well, do you want to stay in the royal entourage? Do stay in the royal entourage, and we'll go back to England together. Becket says, no, I need to sort out the loose ends in where I've been in exile, and I will go back separately. And at that point, you've kind of got a settlement, and you've got paved the way that Becket can go back to England, but you've actually also got the beginnings of further dispute.
So it seems like Becket is almost as stubborn as Henry. Is that?
I think you have two very stubborn people and two people who are both inclined towards action and reaction. And it puts them at loggerheads, and has the potential to repeatedly put them at loggerheads.
All right, so I think we're coming to the end of Thomas Becket's life here. So maybe you could tell us sort of how this goes down.
Yeah, so we kind of left him on the Normandy seacoast, or the seacoast of France, looking at England, and he sets sail for England. As he does so, he pronounces the latest wave of sanctions that the Pope has given him the authority to pronounce, which as a piece of timing is pretty awful. But it's targeted against the bishops and archbishop who crowned the young Henry. Again, and Becket clearly feels he has unfinished business with these people. He pronounces these sentences. He sets sail. He lands in England. They have news of those sentences, and of course they run straight to Henry, who's in Normandy at the time, to tell him about them. So Becket is received in England, and he goes back to Canterbury, and he reinstates himself in Canterbury Cathedral. News reaches Henry in Normandy, and Henry is clearly apoplectic. It's generally thought that Henry never actually used the words "who will rid me of this turbulent priest" that is often kind of thrown around in the context of his reaction, but he clearly did say something that indicated that he was massively angry. And he clearly, or one of the reports in the sources sort of says to us, well, he said something like, who are all these people around me in my court now who I've brought up and raised, and who won't avenge me against this man that I've raised up? And some of Henry's knights see that as encouragement to take matters into their own hands. They cross over back to England. Becket has found himself in a situation where he can't really leave Canterbury because the younger Henry is nominally in charge in England and has said, no, you shouldn't come near me at the moment. Which is interesting as someone who, Becket had formerly been his tutor and that sort of thing. So these knights come back to England. They have connections to places in Kent that are linked to the archbishopric in various ways, and people have been in charge of the lands while Becket's been away and that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of things going on there. But they find their way to Canterbury. And what happens then is like, well, did they intend the outcome here, or did they actually turn up at Canterbury going, we're going to arrest this man? And we're going to take him into royal custody, and then Henry can do what he wants with him. Becket first argues with them. Then clearly they both sort of step back from that argument, but the knights arm themselves. Now that actually must mean there's a fair gap after the initial argument at Canterbury, because it takes a while to put armour on. While they're doing that, the monks of Canterbury take Becket into the cathedral because they think he'll be better protected there. but then the knights follow, and this is where the sort of denouement comes to pass, where Becket starts to celebrate the religious service that's due to start at that point. The knights burst in, and clearly things get out of hand if they did intend to arrest him, because Becket ends up cut down in front of the altar at which he's trying to celebrate the service.
So he was cut down in public. There was people. I didn't realize that. I thought it was sort of a backroom thing.
No, he's cut down in the church, in the cathedral at Canterbury. He's not at the main altar. He's at an altar at one side of the cathedral, roughly where the nave meets the chancel. And it sounds as if he's coming out of the heart. The knights have come towards the cathedral church, and the monks have gone to bar the door. And Becket has said to the monks, "No, it's a house of God. We don't bar the door. If they want to come in, they come in." And they've come in shouting something like, "Where is he? Where is the traitor? Where is the traitor Thomas Becket?" And he's come down the steps towards them, but there is an altar there as well. And he said, "I'm not a traitor. Who is it who seeks me?" These sorts of things. And then as this unfolds, he starts trying to perform the words of the service. So the thought is that he kneels. They draw their swords and they end up striking him. One of the monks, actually a monk who is visiting Canterbury Cathedral at the time, but who later goes on to write a life of Becket, tries to sort of step in the way and gets his arm cut with a sword. And they clearly, what happens? They stab at Becket, but they also, in the process, manage to slice off the top of his head. And as he's then lying there in Canterbury Cathedral, one of them is sort of fishing around in his head with his sword to make sure that the deed is done fully. And then the knights run away, leaving the monks who've witnessed all this to literally pick up the pieces.
Yeah. What happens to the knights?
Well, they flee. One of them has lands in northern England. And they go they end up for a bit in the castle at Knaresborough in Yorkshire. They're not hunted down with any great speed at all. Eventually, as the music catches up with Henry, who is labelled with having been responsible for this, they are, I suppose, sort of brought to justice. The sanction that's imposed on them is one of exile and going to the Holy Land. And most, if not all of them, end up dying in the Holy Land a few years later, and are said to have been buried in places like the entrance to the Temple Church in Jerusalem and things like that.
And so this creates, I guess, would you say it creates a worse problem with Henry, for Henry with the church, or what's sort of like the ultimate fallout of this with Henry?
Certainly Henry knows he has a problem. Whether he's grief-stricken is another thing, but he's, the accounts do talk about him sort of disappearing into his rooms and staying on his own for a long period of time afterwards, and things like that. I think he does know there's a problem, and he knows that he's going to have to handle the church very carefully. Now, one of the things he does in 1171, after this has all happened, is disappear off to Ireland to pursue his interests there, which he's suddenly thought it would be useful to go and deal with, and to some extent that stops the papal legates that Alexander III then sends from getting at him, because he's further away. But when he comes back from that, he works on a settlement with the church. And there are two key points for that. One is in 1172, in something called the settlement at Avranches, which is a place in Normandy, just over on the Norman mainland near Mont Saint Michel. Where he is absolved by the papal legates, public penance is performed, and he promises to do various things like found monasteries, go to the Holy Land, those sorts of things. Equally, though, it's part of the problem here is that it makes people question Henry's authority, because it's for some of the people involved, I think it's a bit of a tipping point. Actually, one of those people is Henry's son, the younger Henry. And you get in 1173-74 the outbreak of what's often termed the Great Rebellion, which involves the young Henry. It involves the other sons who were old enough to take part, so Richard and Geoffrey. It involves a whole series of English earls, but it also then ropes in the Count of Flanders, the King of Scots, and the King of France. So Henry finds himself faced with a rebellion and hostile action on most of his borders. And the way he resolves that, well, apart from actually by military acumen and military acumen on the part of his supporters, is he is able to harness the fact that he's very lucky in his timing. So he returns to England during one phase of this rebellion in 1174, and he goes to Canterbury and he prays and performs penance at Becket's tomb, which at that time is in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral. And it transpires that at pretty much the point he was doing that, the King of Scots was attacking Alnwick Castle in Northumberland. And it's an unsuccessful attack, and the King of Scots is captured. Because of the juxtaposition of timing there, Henry is able to say, while I was performing my penance at Canterbury, the saint, by 1174 Becket has been declared a saint by Alexander III, the saint has forgiven me. And he's shown that he's forgiven me by bringing my enemies to their knees and into my hands. And so it's he's able to flip the narrative and say, now Becket is back on my side. And where are we? We're 1174, right the way through to his death in 1189, except when there are sanctions on the cathedral for other reasons. Every time he comes back to England from Normandy, he goes to Canterbury Cathedral. And whether that's a genuine thing or not, who knows? But it's a very canny, I'm embracing this and using its potential.
So one of the things that I have found maybe somewhat enlightening and useful in sort of looking at these periods of history, and I've mentioned it in a previous podcast about Richard the Lionheart, that in a way it's a little easier to understand him knowing his father. Mm-hmm. Henry the Young King, I think it's generally accepted that he would probably have not made the best king. Maybe seems like maybe not the best, most interested in being king or ruling kind of guy, more of a partier riding around the tournament circuit. And some of that may be partly because of his sort of position of stasis that Henry kind of kept him in. But what sort of effect do you feel like Thomas Becket may have had, given that he was sort of like his foster parent, or he was sort of raised in Thomas Becket's household for a while? What sort of effect do you feel like Thomas Becket and his death, you kind of touched on it a little bit, may have had on Henry the Young King?
I think Henry the Young King is definitely affected by that, and it makes Henry the Young King think, maybe, which is not always something you see associated with Henry the Young King, but I think it does definitely explain why he emerges as the figurehead of the Great Rebellion, because, as you say, he's a king without a kingdom, in a lot of ways, because Henry just won't give him any authority in the areas he said he's going to bequeath to him. The other thing there is perhaps one way that tutor-pupil relationship is seen is that the young king is actually the first royal figure to go to the tomb at Canterbury. He does so before Henry II does. So there's something interesting there. And also maybe then that's why Henry is making sure he gets there. When the Great Rebellion is resolved in 1175, the two kings, father and son, go to Canterbury together. Which must have been an intensely awkward experience for the young king, I would have thought, because it's very much a sort of, here's closure, we're both of the rebellion, we're both going, but obviously the young king lost. So I think he sees it maybe also as an opportunity, but he perhaps with some support from his advisors is made to think, well, the tables have turned on the older king. This is my time, and I should seize it. And the French king particularly is more than happy to egg that on.
And so you've written a book about Thomas Becket. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
So a few years ago, I was the co-editor for an edited collection, The Cult of St Thomas Becket in the Plantagenet World, 1170 to 1220, where working with my colleague Marie-Pierre Gélin at UCL, we brought together a series of academics to write papers about the sort of development of the cult of Becket as a saint in the aftermath of the martyrdom. So people wrote all sorts of things on that. They looked at the sort of the development of the cult. They looked at aspects of the way in which it was presented at Canterbury Cathedral and in Normandy and in narrative sources. And also a number of us thought about the relationship between the cult and the Plantagenet family. So one of the things that you see with Becket's cult as a saint is that it spreads across Europe. And a number of the places that it spreads to are the places where the daughters of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine are married into. And so there are very interesting questions about whether, in effect, the Plantagenets who in a sense caused Becket's death, are also helping to spread the cult across Europe. And you can argue bits of this either way, but Matilda in Saxony, Leonor in Castile, Joanna in Sicily can all be linked to it in that way and discussed in that way at least. And then as a sort of final paper for it to take it through to 1220, I looked at the sort of way in which the Becket dispute and the outcome of the Becket dispute impacted the disputes between Crown and Church in John's reign, and the extent to which Becket could be a model, perhaps, for somebody like Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury in dispute with King John, or equally for Pope Innocent III, trying to make sure that Langton did become Archbishop of Canterbury. And, where Becket's fate is remembered is an interesting part of that. And I mean, for example, Stephen Langton and he wasn't the first archbishop to do it, but certainly it was resonant in that period. He put an image of the martyrdom on the seal that he used for all his documents. And ultimately, I think we can probably say that Langton was no Becket in terms of wanting to be martyred, but he knew how he could use it. So those are the sorts of things we do in the collection, and I think it speaks to a sort of wider question, which I do hope I will go on to write a book on in the future, about the ongoing royal relationship with the cult of Becket. Because I think there's something really interesting about the way in which you've got something that could be used against the crown, is used against the crown, could be the nemesis of the crown, but is then also something that the kings recognise could be their nemesis, and therefore engage with the cult themselves. Try and keep that sense that Henry II had tried to foster, that actually Becket had come back to them.
So I have to ask you perhaps a remedial question, given that I'm the layman here for history. Is referring to this as a cult, is that a technical historical term, or is there some other meaning behind that?
It's really, I suppose it is a technical term in that sense, and it's not a cult in the way that you have in that way. But the medieval saints are seen as a body of people who are a sort of part of the hierarchy of heaven in I suppose Catholic Christian thought, who are there to intercede for the sinner on earth with God. And because they've been alive on earth, they are in a position to sort of serve as an intermediary. Now, what develops around many of the saints is veneration, people coming to pray for that sort of intercession at the church centres where they're buried, or where bits of them are buried, relics, or where things associated with them are buried, clothes, swords, things that in some way touch them or are involved in their lives or martyrdoms or whatever it is. And the those church centres where such devotion is taking place tend to be seen as, quote, cult centres. And it's about the way in which they're pulling people in to express their Christian devotion through the intermediary of the saint who is associated with that church. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Yes. Good.
So what would you say are some of the lasting legacies of Thomas Becket? Would you say that his martyrdom is sort of the preeminent lasting effect, or some of his other ways in which he sort of either flexed the church power or the king's power? What would you say is kind of his lasting legacies?
I mean, I think all of the above in some ways. The martyrdom is the sort of thing that really captures the imagination, does so at the time, and it continues to do so. There are physical legacies as well. You know, the number of people that came to Canterbury on pilgrimage to the tomb and then the shrine that was put up in 1220. You know, look at Canterbury Cathedral. In some ways, it's built on the offerings of the pilgrims. And what survives there is, some of it is what was put there around Becket in the Middle Ages. What else gives us that legacy? I mean, in a way, it's a debate. The debate between Becket and Henry has been being played out ever since, in different ways. Through the Middle Ages, in that kind of which is more important, the church or the state. Henry VIII at the Reformation develops a real hatred for the idea. Once Henry's been persuaded that he should embrace these Protestant ideas, he develops a real hatred for Becket. And he does so because he sees Becket as someone who took the Pope's side against the king. Now, through that, you get a sort of sense that the debate of Henry II versus Becket has been played out in generations of historians ever since, because of the way that the religious background of their time influences the way they look at this. So there's a resonance and a legacy to it as well. And I think it's also particularly fascinating that though the Church of England is essentially a Protestant church, Anglicanism is essentially a Protestant direction in Christian faith, that there is still a very large interest within that communion in the saints of the churches where they were once the centre of devotion in the medieval period. And this was really striking in 2020. Well, okay, we were in pandemic conditions then, but it was the point where there were a whole series of anniversaries across England of saints in various cathedrals, Becket among them. And had there not been a pandemic, all sorts of commemorative events would have taken place in those churches and at those burial sites. And some of them have happened since. And it's a very interesting statement of the ongoing and current interest in what, for Canterbury particularly, what that legacy of Becket is and what it could bring to those church communities today.
Yeah, very interesting. That the sort of this conflict, you can kind of see it play out over time and in sort of different ways, and it's almost like a lasting, sort of the church versus state kind of idea.
Yeah.
Kind of a lasting conflict, I suppose.
Exactly that, and you get for every generation almost, you get, certainly till comparatively recently, you get the historian who's taking the church line and the historian who's taking the state line. And sometimes religious background explains that, and sometimes the sort of way in which they're brought up in, say, a tradition of secular law or something like that dictates it.
And I suppose one last question to bring it back to Henry and the Plantagenets. I was saying in a previous episode, I believe we discussed it briefly with James Noss, about how when Richard takes the cross, which I believe is in 1188, he's Duke of Aquitaine at that time. He's not king.
Yeah.
And this has that he had maybe sort of several motivations to do so. And one of those would have been because he was sort of in rebellion perpetually at this point, a little bit with his father. the protection of the church protection of lands for anyone who's taken the cross. So that sort of maybe puts a hold on the dispute. But I was kind of thinking that there might also have been a bit of an additional angle, being that it sort of is a little bit doubly difficult for his father to do anything to him if he takes the cross, given his contentious relationship with the church in particular, because he obviously had other things, but I think maybe the high watermark of that is the Thomas Becket affair. What do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on maybe sort of how this plays out later in Henry's life, and sort of these maybe conflicts with his sons and things like that?
I think that's an interesting idea, and certainly, Henry the Young King has also used the idea of taking the cross as a sort of two fingers to his father in some ways. Richard, I mean, I suppose the context in the 1180s is that the fall of Jerusalem is such a big thing that rulers can't ignore it. But equally, it's Richard who takes the cross before Henry. So, is Henry thinking, oh, we could orchestrate something here? Or is Henry thinking, oh, God, no, I don't want to go at all? And Henry has been prevaricating. He's been supporting the Holy Land, but trying not to go for quite some time at that point. The other thing there about the Crusade is that it does play into the way in which Henry is judged by some of the writers of the day. So Gerald of Wales, in his De Principis Instructione, the instruction of the prince, which Gerald being Gerald is sort of mix of the text that title implies, and Gerald having a bit of a rant about things he wants to have a rant about. Gerald, the sort of broader context of that is that Gerald, I think, comes to see Henry II as a king for whom the wheel of fortune turned. This ostensibly a very successful king who rises to the height of his power, but then who by the end, with the rebellion of his sons, is reduced to virtually nothing and is at the whim of those sons in terms of of the French king in terms of what happens to him. And Gerald's argument would be that there are two main factors that explain that. One of which is that Henry is a king who didn't go on crusade when he should have done. The other of which is Becket, is that Henry is the king who caused the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, and a Europe-wide furore in the process. And that, in a way, does bring the two things together. I think one of the things that listeners might find interesting to sort of look further at would be the sort of large range of material culture that survives around, Becket as a saint. So, you can think about things like the stained glass at Canterbury and elsewhere. You can think about some of the things like pilgrim badges. I don't know if you can see, if I hold up, there's a replica pilgrim badge here, which depicts a figure in a sort of shrine-like structure, and there are really quite large numbers of those that survive. If you looked at the website of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, you'd find some of those to look at, for example. And they're the sorts of things that pilgrims bought when they went to Canterbury Cathedral, and took away with them, and quite often then lobbed in the Thames when they got to London. And they crossed London Bridge and visited the Becket Chapel on London Bridge. But there's other things as well. There's a whole series of things where holy water associated with Becket that was thought to be sort of thought to have very small amounts of his blood in it, were sold, and some of those survive. There's also a whole range of things like textiles, wall paintings, those sorts of things. So it's something that inspires a very rich material and visual culture that people might find interesting to look at a bit further.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure to have you on. We'll have your book in the description. If anybody would like to check that out, you'll find the link there. And I'll leave you with the last word. If you have anything else that you'd like to say on the subject, Henry II, Thomas Becket, Angevin Empire, whatever you'd like.
Well, I will simply say thank you, Michael, for having me on again. It's always a pleasure to discuss Becket, and watch this space for some more Becket-related things, I think, in the future as research develops.